March 5, 1946, 11:47 a.m., San Francisco Bay, California. Lieutenant Commander Harold Ellison stood on the deck of the worn destroyer, his hand resting on rusted railings that bore Japanese paint. 24 years after her commissioning, the USS Stuart was coming home, not as a hero, but as a ghost that refused to die. The engines had failed near Guam. Again, what should have been a triumphant voyage had become a humiliating tow across 3,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, dragged by tugboats like a corpse that wouldn't stay buried. And now, as the Golden Gate Bridge loomed ahead, Ellison knew the truth that Navy brass wouldn't say aloud. In 2 months, American forces would deliberately destroy this ship, the same vessel they just spent 6 months recovering. The same destroyer that had survived being sunk twice, served 2 enemies, and become the only American warship ever captured and operated by Imperial Japan. But before we understand why American engineers would sink their own ship, we need to go back 4 years to a night when everything went catastrophically wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most bizarre naval stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold history. We've got some incredible twists ahead. February 19th, 1942, 11:23 p.m., Badung Strait, off the coast of Bali. The Stuart was already taking water. Commander Henry Hamilton Dot stood in the darkened bridge, listening to damage reports crackling over the intercom. His destroyer had just been hit 3 times in a confused night battle against Japanese forces, a chaotic engagement where friendly and enemy ships had fired on each other in the darkness, sometimes at ranges so close that gunners could see faces. The worst hit had come aft below the waterline. The steering engine room was flooding. 2 feet of water sloshed around the machinery, and by some miracle the steering engines were still operating. But Hamilton knew his ship was in trouble. Real trouble. "Maintain station," he ordered. His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the railing until his knuckles went white. The Stuart had been designed to fight submarines and torpedo boats, not to slug it out with Japanese destroyers in a night engagement. She was a Clemson-class destroyer, one of the 4 stackers built in the frantic shipbuilding push of 1918 and 1919. At 314 feet long, with 4 distinctive funnels and a top speed of 35 knots, she looked formidable. But by 1942 standards, she was obsolete. To understand just how obsolete, you need to know what the Stuart was built for. She'd been laid down in Philadelphia in September 1919, commissioned a year later. She'd been designed to hunt German U-boats that no longer existed by the time she entered service. The Great War had ended while she was still on the building slips. She and her sisters, there were 156 Clemson-class destroyers in total, represented the largest class of destroyers ever built by the United States Navy. Most would never see the combat they were designed for. The Stuart had spent the interwar years in the Asiatic fleet, cruising between Manila, Shanghai, and various Chinese ports. She'd been there in 1932 when the Japanese attacked Shanghai, protecting American citizens. She'd watched as tensions rose throughout the 1930s, as Japan invaded China, as the world slid inevitably toward another war. Her crew knew the ship was old. The machinery required constant maintenance. The boilers were temperamental. The hull plates were thinning in places, but she was still capable, still functional. And in the desperate early months of the Pacific War, the Navy needed every hull that could float and fight. Most of her sisters had been scrapped or transferred to the British under the Destroyers for Bases deal in 1940. The Stuart had survived only because she'd been assigned to the Asiatic fleet, stationed in the Philippines and China, far from the European war that demanded those ships. Now, in the waters off Bali, she was fighting for her life against an enemy that had been training for this exact scenario for years. The night battle had been a disaster from the start. The Allied forces, a mixed Dutch, British, Australian, and American fleet under Dutch Admiral Karel Doorman, had tried to stop a Japanese invasion force, but the Japanese excelled at night combat. Their destroyers had torpedoes that could reach farther, hit harder. Their crews had trained relentlessly for exactly this kind of engagement. The battle had developed in 3 separate phases throughout the night. The Stuart was part of the second wave, arriving after midnight. The Dutch had gone in first and been badly mauled. Now it was the Americans' turn, and they were sailing into chaos. The problem with night naval combat is that it's almost impossible to tell friend from foe. Ships appear as dark shapes against darker water. Identification depends on silhouette, on recognition signals that might not be seen in the confusion of battle. Gun flashes blind you, smoke obscures everything. And all the while, torpedoes are running through the water, invisible death that could come from any direction. The Stuart's crew had trained for this, but training and reality are vastly different things. In training, you know who the enemy is. You know the general plan. In the Badung Strait that night, nobody knew anything for certain. Hamilton had ordered the torpedo tubes manned. The Stuart carried 12 torpedo tubes in 4 triple mounts, her primary offensive weapon against larger ships. The torpedoes themselves were Mark 15s, 21 inches in diameter, carrying 825 pounds of TNT. They could reach out to 15,000 yards at 45 knots. They were the great equalizer, a destroyer's best chance of sinking a cruiser or even a battleship. The torpedoes launched, trailing phosphorescent wakes that marked their path through the dark water. Then came the agonizing wait to see if they'd find targets. In the confusion, Hamilton couldn't be sure what he'd fired at: a Japanese destroyer, a transport, or possibly, God forbid, one of their own ships. The return fire gave him his answer. Japanese shells began falling around the Stuart. The enemy had spotted them. The Stuart had fired her torpedoes, watched them streak away into the darkness. Whether they'd hit anything, Hamilton couldn't say. Everything had dissolved into chaos. Star shells bursting overhead, the flash of guns, the peculiar whine of shells passing overhead, followed by the crump of near misses throwing up columns of water. Then came the hits. The first 2 had mangled the torpedo tubes, smashed the boats. The third had torn into the hull below the waterline, and now the sea was coming in. Hamilton made the only decision he could: get to port, now. By dawn, the Stuart limped into Surabaya harbor on the eastern tip of Java. The crew was exhausted, nerves frayed from a night of combat, and the constant fear that the flooding would get worse. But they'd made it. The ship was still afloat. The real nightmare was about to begin. February 22nd, 1942, 9:15 a.m. Surabaya Naval Base, Dutch East Indies. The Stuart was the most severely damaged ship from the battle, so she was given priority for the floating dry dock. It was a 15,000-ton dock, more than capable of lifting a destroyer. The Dutch workers positioned the keel blocks underneath the ship, supporting structures that would bear the weight as the dock was raised. But they were rushing. Everyone in Surabaya was rushing now. Japanese forces were closing in on Java. Air raids came daily. The port would fall. Everyone knew it. It was just a question of when. The dock began to rise, lifting the Stuart clear of the water. It should have been routine. Destroyers had been dry-docked thousands of times. Then something went wrong. The keel block shifted, or maybe they hadn't been positioned correctly in the first place. Years later, survivors would argue about what exactly happened. But the result was unmistakable. As the dock continued to rise, the Stuart's weight wasn't properly supported. The destroyer began to tip. Metal groaned. Men shouted. And then the ship fell. The Stuart crashed onto her side in 12 feet of water, her propeller shafts bending, her hull buckling. The impact drove the air from men's lungs. Sailors who'd survived the night battle now found themselves clinging to railing as their ship. When the motion finally stopped, the Stuart lay on her port side, a dying whale, half submerged in the dry dock, taking on more water. The damage from the battle had been this new damage was. Hamilton stood on the slanted deck looking at his ship. There was no way to repair this. Not here. Not now. Not with Japanese bombers overhead and enemy ground forces less than a week away. The Stuart's crew was broken up and reassigned to the remaining American destroyers at Surabaya. Port authorities began preparing demolition charges. If they couldn't save the ship, they'd make sure the Japanese couldn't use her. But here's what nobody expected. The demolition wouldn't be enough. March 2nd, 1942, 11 p.m., Surabaya harbor. The Dutch were evacuating. The last ships were pulling out, racing to stay ahead of the Japanese advance. In the harbor, the Stuart lay dark and silent, abandoned, with explosive charges set throughout her hull. The charges detonated. The floating dry dock was scuttled, sending the Stuart to the bottom of the harbor. As if to ensure the ship's destruction, a Japanese bomb hit amidships during the final air raid, adding more damage to the wreck. The ship that had served the United States Navy for 22 years was gone. On March 25, 1942, she was officially struck from the Navy list. The name Stuart was reassigned to a new destroyer escort, DE-238, then under construction in Houston. The story should have ended there. For most ships it would have, but the Stuart wasn't most ships. February 1943, Surabaya Harbor, Japanese-occupied Java. The Japanese had a problem. They needed every ship they could get. The war wasn't going as planned. American forces were fighting back, and the Imperial Navy was bleeding hulls. Destroyers, cruisers, carriers, all were precious. Nothing could be wasted. So when engineers surveyed Surabaya Harbor and found the American destroyer sitting on the bottom, they made an unusual decision: raise it. It took weeks. The Japanese refloated the Scuttled dry dock first, then used it to lift the Stuart from the harbor floor. The ship emerged covered in barnacles and rust, her interior flooded, her machinery destroyed by seawater and demolition charges. She was, by any reasonable standard, a total loss. But Lieutenant Fukui Shizuo, didn't see a total loss. He saw possibilities. Fukui was the contractor assigned to restore the Stuart. He had access to the number 102 Naval Construction Department dry dock and a crew of workers who had experience with captured vessels. The work would take months, but it was possible. They'd done it before with smaller craft. First, they had to clean out the ship. Everything inside was contaminated with seawater, oil, and rust. Machinery had to be stripped out and replaced. The hull had to be patched, welded, reinforced. Then came the modifications. The Stuart's original armament, her American guns, were removed. In their place, Fukui installed 2 captured Dutch 75mm anti-aircraft guns and 2 12 7mm machine guns. The torpedo tubes, damaged beyond repair in the original battle, were simply removed. This wouldn't be a ship for aggressive combat. It would be an escort vessel, a patrol boat. The Japanese didn't try to disguise what the ship was. They added a distinctive trunked funnel, a Japanese modification, but the 4-stack silhouette remained unmistakable. Anyone who knew destroyers would recognize this as an American. September 20th, 1943, the Stuart was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy as patrol boat number 102. The ceremony was small, nothing like the grand commissioning she'd received in Philadelphia 23 years earlier. A handful of Japanese naval officers, Lieutenant Fukui and his construction crew, and the men who would form the new crew. They raised the Rising Sun flag over a ship that had been built to fight Imperial Japan. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The Japanese Navy didn't fully trust the Stuart. She was an enemy ship, built to enemy specifications, maintained by enemy standards. Her machinery was different from Japanese equipment. Her electrical systems operated on different voltages. Even small things like pipe fittings and fasteners were non-standard, but they needed her. By September 1943, the tide of war was turning against Japan. The Guadalcanal campaign had cost them dearly. American submarines were wreaking havoc on Japanese shipping. Every convoy that left port faced the risk of torpedo attack. Every transport, every tanker, every cargo ship carrying the resources Japan desperately needed. Patrol Boat 102 would help protect those convoys. Not by fighting, she wasn't equipped for major combat, but by being present, by adding another hull to the escort screen, by giving submarine commanders one more target to worry about. For the next 2 years, PB-102 served as a convoy escort in the Southwest Area Fleet. It wasn't glamorous duty. The ship shepherded transport vessels, tankers, cargo ships, the unglamorous but essential work of keeping supplies moving. She operated primarily in the waters between Japan, Korea, and China, following routes that were increasingly dangerous as American submarines grew bolder and more numerous. The crew learned to work with the ship's quirks. The Dutch guns were reliable but different from Japanese artillery. The ammunition had to be specially stored and handled. The engines required careful monitoring. They were old, worn, and prone to breakdowns that required creative solutions since replacement parts didn't exist. On August 23, 1944, while operating in consort with the anti-submarine vessel CD-22, Patrol Boat 102 witnessed the sinking of the American submarine USS Harder. CD-22 made the kill with depth charges, and PB-102's crew watched as oil and debris surfaced, evidence of another American submarine lost. 80 men died aboard the Harder, men who were, in some abstract sense, the Stuart's former comrade. The crew of PB-102 had no time to contemplate that irony. War doesn't pause for philosophical reflection. But this created an impossible situation for Allied pilots. Imagine you're flying a patrol mission over the South China Sea in 1944. You're in a Grumman TBF Avenger, cruising at 5,000 feet, your eyes scanning the water below for the distinctive wakes of ships. You've been flying for 3 hours and your fuel is getting low, but you keep searching because intelligence reports indicate a Japanese convoy in this area. Then you see them, 6 cargo ships in 2 columns, with escort vessels positioned around the perimeter. Standard Japanese convoy formation. You bank to get a better look, calculating attack angle, trying to determine if you have enough fuel to make a run and still get back to the carrier. And that's when you see it. One of the escort vessels is wrong. The silhouette isn't right for a Japanese destroyer. It's got 4 stacks, 4 distinct smokestacks in a line. And you know that silhouette. You've studied it in recognition books. You've seen it in photographs of your own fleet. That's an American destroyer, a 4-piper, a Clemson class or maybe a Wikis class. You can't tell from this altitude, but it's definitely American, except it's flying the Japanese flag, and it's escorting enemy cargo ships deep in Japanese-controlled waters. You radio it in. Your wing commander's response is skeptical. Check again. Make sure. You're tired. You've been flying for hours. Maybe it's the light, maybe it's wishful thinking. So you make another pass, lower this time, close enough to be sure. Close enough to see the rising sun painted on the funnel. Close enough to confirm that, yes, this is impossible, but it's real. The debriefing after you land is awkward. The intelligence officers don't quite believe you. American destroyers don't serve in the Japanese Navy. All our destroyers are accounted for. You must have seen something else, something Japanese that resembles an American ship from certain angles. But you know what you saw, and you're not the only one. Over the following months, more reports come in. Different pilots, different locations, all describing the same thing. An American four-stack destroyer operating behind Japanese lines. By mid-1944, the reports are too numerous to dismiss. Naval intelligence starts taking them seriously. They compile the sightings, try to establish patterns, attempt to identify which ship this could possibly be. The problem is that it's impossible. Every American four-stack destroyer is accounted for. Many have been sunk. The Navy knows where and when. Others are still in service, their locations documented. Some were transferred to the British and are operating in the Atlantic. The rest are in reserve or have been scrapped. There are no missing American destroyers that could explain these sightings, so the ship becomes a mystery, a ghost. The intelligence reports start referring to it as the Ghost Ship of the Pacific, a designation that's half legend, half serious attempt to track an unexplained phenomenon. Nobody could figure it out. The Stuart was officially listed as destroyed. All the four-stack destroyers were accounted for, so what were the pilots seeing? The answer wouldn't come until the war ended. August 1945, Hiro Bay, east of Kure, Japan. The war was over. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender after atomic bombs devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. American occupation forces were spreading across Japan, taking control of ports, bases, military installations. 3 U.S. naval officers arrived at Hiro Bay to inspect Japanese vessels. They were conducting routine surveys, cataloging what ships remained, determining what could be salvaged or needed to be destroyed. And then, they found her. Patrol Boat 102 sat at the dock, her paint peeling, her decks cluttered with the debris of defeat. The Japanese crew had been reduced to a skeleton staff. The ship was rat-infested, filthy, worn out by years of hard service. But the American officers recognized what they were looking at immediately. The 4 stacks were unmistakable, even with Japanese modifications. The hull configuration, the placement of the gun mounts, the overall lines of the ship. This was a Clemson-class destroyer. One of the officers consulted his reference materials, comparing what he saw to the specifications of known Japanese vessels. Nothing matched. This wasn't a ship that appeared in any Japanese naval registry they had access to. Then one of them noticed the hull number, barely visible under layers of paint. They had the dock workers begin cleaning the hull, carefully removing paint to reveal what was underneath. DD-224 emerged, an American designation, a U.S. Navy hull number. The officers checked their records. DD-224 had been the USS Stuart, commissioned 1920, assigned to the Asiatic Fleet, lost at Surabaya, March 1942, struck from the Navy list, March 25, 1942. Except she wasn't lost. She was here, in Hiro Bay, sitting at a Japanese dock, having spent the last 2 years serving the enemy. The mystery of the ghost ship was solved. The impossible sightings, the reports that had been questioned and doubted, were all true. American pilots had been seeing an American destroyer, because an American destroyer was exactly what it was: captured, repaired, and pressed into Japanese service. The implications were significant. This wasn't just a curiosity. The Stuart represented intelligence value. How had the Japanese repaired her? What modifications had they made? What could be learned from examining an American ship that had been operated by the enemy for 2 years? But more than that, the ship represented a symbol, the only U.S. Navy destroyer ever captured and operated by an enemy force. In the entire history of American naval warfare, this had never happened before. Ships had been sunk, destroyed, scuttled, but never captured intact and put into enemy service. The decision about what to do with the Stuart came from higher up the chain of command. The ship would be returned to the United States, not because she was valuable as a military asset. By 1945 standards, she was hopelessly obsolete, but because she was American property and she needed to come home. The Japanese crew and dock workers were ordered to thoroughly clean, fumigate, and paint the ship. It took days. The rats had to be exterminated. The interior had to be scrubbed. Years of accumulated grime and neglect had to be addressed before the ship could be considered even marginally habitable. The Americans raised their flag on October 29, 1945, in what witnesses described as an emotional ceremony. Some of the men present had fought in the Java Sea campaign. Some had known crew members from the original Stuart. For all of them, seeing an American flag fly over this particular ship again carried weight that was hard to articulate. The ship was recommissioned, but she didn't get her name back. The name Stuart had already been assigned to a new destroyer escort, DE-238, which was still in active service. So the old destroyer became simply DD-2224, a hull number without a name, a ship without an identity in the official records. But the crew who would sail her home gave her an unofficial designation, Ramp 224. The acronym stood for Recovered Allied Military Personnel, the term used for prisoners of war and others who had been liberated from Japanese captivity. It was a fitting name. The ship was, in a sense, a prisoner coming home. The voyage home should have been triumphant. It wasn't. The Stuart's engines, in constant service since 1920, were completely worn out. The Japanese had kept her running through makeshift repairs and force of will, but there was nothing left. Near Guam, the engines failed completely. She had to be towed. The USS Wesson took the first leg. Then a succession of Navy tugs dragged the old destroyer across the Pacific. It took weeks. The crew of Ramp 224 stood watch over a ship that was barely floating, held together by rust and stubbornness. When she finally entered San Francisco Bay on March 5, 1946, she was flying a long, homeward-bound pennant, a traditional signal that a ship had completed a foreign deployment, but there was nothing traditional about this return. Lieutenant Commander Charles Lewis Best came to see her. He'd commanded the Stuart from 1924 to 1926, back when she was young and the world was still at peace. He walked her decks one last time, seeing what his old ship had become. Battered, exhausted, transformed by years of service to two different nations, the Navy conducted a board of inspection. Their conclusion was swift and final. The Stuart was condemned. Too old, too damaged, too worn out to be worth repairing. She was stripped of anything useful. Then she was rigged for scuttling. Again, May 24, 1946, 1:30 p.m., 55 miles off the Golden Gate. The tugboat USS Algorma towed the Stuart to her final position in deep water, well offshore. The location had been chosen carefully, deep enough that the wreck wouldn't be a navigation hazard, far enough from shore that the bombardment wouldn't alarm civilians, but close enough that it wouldn't require excessive fuel expenditure for the aircraft and ships involved. The old destroyer sat low in the water, empty, awaiting her fate. The tow lines were cast off. The Algorma moved to a safe distance. And then, the exercise began. This was, officially, a training exercise. The Navy needed to give pilots and gunners practice against realistic targets. Surplus ships were regularly used for this purpose. It was cheaper than building artificial targets and provided more realistic training. But everyone involved knew this was different. This wasn't just target practice. This was the deliberate destruction of a ship that had served two navies, survived two scuttlings, and become part of naval legend. The men on the USS PC-799, the submarine chaser assigned to deliver the coup de grace, understood they were participating in something more than routine training. Navy aircraft approached first, F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats, the same types that had dominated the Pacific skies in the final years of the war. They made their runs from different angles, testing attack pattern, firing 5-inch rockets into the superstructure. The rockets hit with tremendous force. Each impact sent shockwaves through the hull. Explosions ripped through the bridge, the gun positions, the empty compartments where men had once stood watch. Fire broke out, sending black smoke into the clear California sky. The Stuart's superstructure began to collapse under the assault, but the hull remained intact. The ship continued to float, burning but defiant. The planes made another pass. More rockets, more fire. By now, the entire superstructure was ablaze. The 4 distinctive stacks, the defining feature of the Clemson class, were being systematically destroyed. But still the ship floated. The pilots returned to their carrier, their ammunition expended, their part in the exercise complete. Now it was the Navy's turn. The USS PC-799 moved in slowly, deliberately, until she was at point-blank range, just 300 yards from the burning hulk. At that distance, you couldn't miss. Every shell would find its target. The order was given: fire. The 40mm guns opened up first, their rapid-fire shells stitching a line across the Stuart's hull. 12 rounds, each one punching through steel that was already weakened by age and fire. Then came the 3-inch guns, heavier, more powerful. 17 shells, aimed at the waterline, designed to open the hull and let the sea pour in. Each impact was visible from the PC-799's deck. Each shell created a new hole, a new wound in a ship that had already endured more than any destroyer should have to endure. The crew of the PC-799 watched in professional silence, counting rounds, noting impacts, performing their duty with the efficiency that training demanded. But there was something else in that silence, a recognition that they were destroying something that didn't want to die, something that had earned the right to a better end than this. 29 shells in total. The bombardment continued for 2 hours, far longer than it should have taken to sink an empty destroyer. The Stuart absorbed everything they threw at her, Water poured through the holes in her hull. Fire consumed what was left of her superstructure, and still she floated, listing but not sinking, burning but not surrendering. Commander Anderson, captain of the PC-799, later reported that he'd never seen a target take so much punishment and remain afloat. The ship had been rigged for scuttling. Her seacocks should have been open, her interior compartmentalized to flood quickly, but somehow the steward was holding on. One of the sailors on the PC-799 remarked that it was like she don't want to go. The comment wasn't meant to be poetic, but that's exactly what it was. The ship that had refused to sink in Surabaya, that had survived Japanese demolition charges and years of neglect, was refusing one final time. Finally, after 2 hours of continuous bombardment, the steward began to list heavily to port, the same side she'd fallen on in the Surabaya dry dock 4 years earlier. Water had finally overcome the internal compartmentalization. The hull, riddled with holes, could no longer maintain buoyancy. The list increased. 40 degrees, 50. The ship began to roll, slowly at first, then faster as the center of gravity shifted beyond the point of recovery. At 3:47 p.m., the USS Stewart capsized completely and slipped beneath the waves. The San Francisco Examiner reported that the stubborn old can had held out for 15 minutes against the final assault before she dipped forever under the waters. But here's the thing about forever. It's not as permanent as we think. August 2024, Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary, California. Ocean Infinity, a marine robotics company, was testing a new technique, deploying 3 autonomous underwater vehicles simultaneously to map the seafloor. The technology was cutting edge. These weren't the tethered ROVs of previous decades, but fully autonomous drones capable of operating independently for hours, covering vast areas while maintaining precise positioning and detailed sonar imaging. The company had already made headlines with previous discoveries. In 2020, their drones had found the USS Nevada, the battleship that had survived Pearl Harbor only to be used for atomic bomb tests. In 2022, they'd helped rediscover Ernest Shackleton's Endurance, the Antarctic exploration ship that had been lost for over a century. Now they needed a test target for their multi-drone technique. They needed something specific to search for, something with a known approximate location, but unknown exact coordinates. Something that would prove their system could work. Russ Matthews from the Air Sea Heritage Foundation had an idea: try to find the Stewart. He'd been researching the ship for over a decade, fascinated by its unique history. He'd tracked down previously classified documents from the National Archives, logbook entries from the ships involved in the 1946 sinking exercise. Those logs provided coordinates, though with the navigation technology of 1946, those coordinates were approximate at best. The area to search was 37 square nautical miles of seafloor. With traditional survey methods, scanning that much area in detail would take weeks, possibly months. You'd need to send down tethered, remotely operated vehicles, sweep back and forth in a careful grid pattern, process data slowly and methodically. Ocean Infinity's approach was different. 3 autonomous underwater vehicles, each 20 feet long and packed with state-of-the-art sonar equipment, would be deployed simultaneously. They would divide the search area between them, covering it in parallel sweeps, communicating with each other to avoid overlap, processing data in real time. The drones descended on a clear August morning, their orange hulls disappearing into blue water, then into darkness as they dove deeper. 3,500 feet down, beyond the reach of sunlight, beyond the range where most marine life can survive, down to where the pressure is over 1,600 pounds per square inch, where the temperature hovers just above freezing, where the only light comes from bioluminescent creatures and the sonar pulses of the drones themselves. The sonar swept back and forth, building a picture of the seafloor. Mud, mostly, silt deposited over decades, occasional rock outcroppings, the slow accumulation of marine snow, dead organisms and debris drifting down from the surface. And then, within hours of beginning the search, one of the drones detected something different, a shape that was too regular, too geometric to be natural. The sonar signature of worked metal, of human construction, of a ship. Andy Sherrill, Ocean Infinity's Director of Maritime Operations, watched the data come in on the surface. The resolution was remarkable. Synthetic aperture sonar that could distinguish details as small as a few inches. And what they were seeing was unmistakable. A destroyer, sitting upright on the bottom, remarkably intact despite 78 years underwater, and the bombardment that had sunk her. The 4 stacks were still visible, though damaged. The hull was intact along most of its length. The superstructure was collapsed, evidence of the rocket and shell impact, but recognizable. And most remarkably, the ship was sitting almost perfectly upright, not on her side, not capsized, but as if she'd settled gently to the bottom and decided to rest there. We covered it very quickly, and in high resolution. Cheryl would later tell the New York Times. What should have taken weeks had taken hours. The technology had proven itself beyond all expectations, but the discovery was more than just a technical achievement. This was the ghost ship, the vessel that pilots had reported behind enemy lines, the destroyer that had served two nations, the ship that had refused to stay sunk. A remote-operated submersible was deployed to get visual confirmation. Unlike the autonomous drones, this one was tethered, controlled directly from the surface. Equipped with high-definition cameras, it descended through the same dark water, guided by the coordinates the drones had provided. The first images came back on the live video feed. The bow emerged from the gloom, sleek and pointed, the anchor chains still visible. The cameras moved along the hull, documenting damage, noting the condition of the steel after nearly 8 decades underwater. The preservation was exceptional. In the cold, dark water of the deep Pacific, away from the destructive currents and marine growth that damaged shallower wrecks, the Stuart had been perfectly preserved. The metal was still intact. The structure was sound. This wasn't a pile of wreckage. This was a ship, recognizable, complete, a time capsule from 1946. Dr. James Delgado from Search, Inc., who'd been trying to locate the Stuart for over a decade as part of Norway's Maritime Heritage Program, watched the video feed with something approaching awe. He'd spent years advocating for this search, arguing that the Stuart deserved to be found, documented, protected. Now, seeing the images coming back in real time, he could hardly believe it. This ship, in its own way, basically was humanized by the Navy, he said later. People pour so much into ships, and we have since the beginning of time. They represent us. Maria Brown, superintendent for Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary, noted the exceptional preservation. This level of preservation is exceptional for a vessel of its age and makes it potentially one of the best preserved examples of a U.S. Navy four-piper destroyer known to exist. The Stuart's location placed her squarely within the boundaries of the National Marine Sanctuary, which meant she would be protected by federal law. No salvage operations would be permitted. No unauthorized diving. The wreck would remain where it lay, a protected site, sovereign U.S. property under the Sunken Military Craft Act. Rear Admiral Samuel Cox, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, emphasized this point. Whether lost in battle or sunk as a target, a warship remains sovereign property in perpetuity. It is important to know the location and condition of such wrecks so that they may be protected from unauthorized disturbance. The Discovery team spent days documenting the wreck. The cameras captured every angle, every detail. The sonar built three-dimensional maps showing the exact position and orientation. The data would be preserved, made available to researchers, used to ensure the protection of the site. But perhaps the most powerful images were the simplest. The four stacks, damaged but still standing, silhouetted against the dark water, the symbol of a generation of destroyers, preserved on the ocean floor, a monument to a ship that had refused to be forgotten. So why did American engineers sink the Stuart? Why not preserve her, given her unique history? The answer is complex, layered with practical considerations and something harder to define. Practically, the ship was finished. The hull was old, the machinery worn beyond repair. The Navy had no use for obsolete destroyers in 1946. They had hundreds of newer, better ships. The cost of restoration would have been enormous, the benefit minimal. But there's another reason, one that's harder to quantify. The Stuart represented something uncomfortable: American defeat, capture, a ship that had served the enemy. In 1946, with the war just ended, there was no appetite for preserving symbols of Japan's victories, even temporary ones. The decision to use her as target practice, to have American forces deliberately destroy her, was a way of reclaiming control. The Stuart had been captured, operated by Japan, turned against American interests. The final bombardment was, in a sense, a way of ensuring that the last thing the ship did was serve American purposes, even if that purpose was simply absorbing fire. Lieutenant Commander Harold Ellison, who'd overseen the recommissioning in Japan, understood. The ceremony in Hero Bay had been emotional because the men involved knew this wasn't a rescue, it was a retrieval. They were bringing the ship home not to celebrate, but to close the book on an uncomfortable chapter. One veteran of the ceremony later said it felt like bringing home a prisoner of war, not a ship. The Stuart's story is unique in American naval history. She's the only U.S. Navy destroyer ever captured and operated by an enemy force. She served under 2 flags, survived 2 scuttlings, and became a ghost story that turned out to be true. But her rediscovery in 2024 raises a new question. What do we do with her now? Under the Sunken Military Craft Act, the wreck remains sovereign U.S. property. Rear Admiral Samuel Cox, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, emphasized that the location must be protected from unauthorized disturbance. Some historians argue the Stuart should be protected as a war grave, even though no crew died with her in 1946. Others see her as an archaeological site, a time capsule of early 20th century destroyer design. Dr. Delgado offers another perspective. Its story, from U.S. Navy service to Japanese capture and back again, makes it a powerful symbol of the Pacific War's complexity. That complexity is worth preserving. The Pacific War wasn't simple. It wasn't just good versus evil, clear victories and defeats. It was messy, complicated, filled with moments like the Stuart's capture. Not dramatic battles, but accidents, miscalculations, the chaos of ports under attack and decisions made in desperation. The Stuart sat at the bottom of Surabaya Harbor for a year before the Japanese raised her. American demolition charges should have destroyed her. They didn't. Japanese engineers shouldn't have been able to restore her. They did. Allied pilots saw her behind enemy lines, and nobody believed them, until they were proven right. At every turn, the Stuart defied expectations. She survived when she shouldn't have. She served when she should have been scrap. She became a ghost ship, and then came home. When the bombardment finally sank her in 1946, witnesses reported she took everything they threw at her and still fought to stay afloat. 2 hours of concentrated fire to sink a destroyer that was already rigged for scuttling. The same stubbornness that kept her steering engines running with 2 feet of water in the compartment. The same refusal to quit that defined her entire service. There's something deeply American about that stubbornness. The unwillingness to go down easy, even when defeat is inevitable. The capacity to endure, survive, keep fighting. And there's something deeply human about the men who served aboard her, both American and Japanese. They poured their labor, their skill, their lives into keeping this ship afloat. They made her more than steel and machinery. They made her represent something. For the Americans who scuttled her in 1942, she represented a desperate need to deny the enemy resources. For the Japanese who raised her in 1943, she represented the ingenuity and determination needed to keep fighting against growing odds. For the Americans who found her in 1945, she represented the complexity of war, the strange twists of fate that can turn weapons against their creators. And for the engineers who sank her in 1946, she represented closure, the end of a story that had gone on too long, taken too many strange turns. It was time to let her rest. For 78 years, the Pacific kept that secret. The exact location of the Stuart's grave was lost, known only approximately, one more forgotten detail in the vast catalog of World War II's aftermath. But now we found her again, and in finding her, we've recovered more than just a shipwreck. We've recovered a piece of history that defied every expectation, a story that refused to end cleanly, a ship that wouldn't stay buried. The Stuart sits on the bottom now, 3,500 feet down in the Cordell Bank National Marine Sanctuary. The autonomous drones that found her captured images of a hull that's still recognizable, still intact, still defying the odds after all these years. She's not coming up. There are no plans to raise her, to restore her, to bring her back to the surface. That chapter is closed. But her story isn't finished. Isn't. Because every time someone hears about the ghost ship of the Pacific, about the destroyer that served 2 navies, about the ship that American engineers had to sink twice, the Stuart leaves again, not as steel and rivets and machinery, as something else, something that survives beyond the physical, as memory, as history, as a reminder that even in war, even in defeat, even in the desperate chaos of retreat and capture and bombardment, human beings create meaning. The Stuart means something now that she never meant during her service. She's become a symbol of complexity, of the messy reality of war, of the capacity for machines to take on significance beyond their designed purpose. When Lieutenant Commander Best visited her in San Francisco in 1946, seeing his old command one last time before she was destroyed, he must have felt something of that significance. The ship he'd commanded in peaceful waters off China in the 1920s had lived through things he couldn't have imagined: night battles, capture, service under an enemy flag, years of hard use, and finally this strange homecoming. She'd become something more than the destroyer he remembered. She'd become history, and now, discovered again in the deep waters off California, she remains history, protected, preserved by depth and darkness, a memorial to all the men who served aboard her under both flags, the American sailors who fought her in the Java Sea, who tried to save her in Surabaya, who abandoned her to the approaching enemy, the Japanese engineers and crews who raised her, restored her, kept her running through years of war, the American prize crew who brought her home, giving her a new name that honored her not as a ship but as a survivor, Ramp 224, recovered Allied military personnel, and finally, the engineers who sank her, not out of hate or vengeance, but because it was time, because every story needs an ending, even one as strange and complicated as this. The Stuart got her ending on May 24, 1946. After 2 hours of bombardment, after surviving longer than anyone expected, she finally let go, rolled to port, slipped under, found the peace that had eluded her throughout her extraordinary service. But endings, as we've learned, aren't always permanent. The Stuart came back once, raised from the harbor in Surabaya. She came back again, found by drones in 2024. She keeps coming back, in stories, in memories, in the historical record, because some ships are more than just ships. Some become symbols of human endurance, ingenuity, stubbornness, all the qualities that define us at our best and worst. The Stuart was never the most powerful destroyer, never the fastest, never the most modern. By 1942, she was already obsolete, a relic of the previous war pressed into service for a new one. But she endured. Against every odd, through every disaster, she kept going, kept floating, kept fighting, until American engineers, recognizing that some stories need proper endings, gave her one. The ghost ship of the Pacific is at rest now, deep in the sanctuary waters where she belongs, protected by law, preserved by depth, remembered by history. And in a way, that's the most fitting end for a ship that refused every other ending offered to her. She went down on her own terms, in American waters, under American fire, serving one last purpose, reminding us that history is never simple, war is never clean, and the stories worth remembering are often the ones that don't fit neat categories of victory and defeat. The Stuart story fits no categories. It just is. Strange, compelling, uniquely American in its stubborn refusal to conform to expectations. And now, rediscovered in the deep Pacific, she tells that story one more time to anyone willing to listen. Some ships are meant to be forgotten. The Stuart was meant to be remembered. The sailors who served aboard the Stuart in her final years, both American and Japanese, carried memories that haunted them for decades. In the 1970s and 1980s, as historians began documenting oral histories of the Pacific War, some of these men finally spoke about their experiences. Seaman First Class Robert Chen, who had been part of the Stuart's crew during the Badung Strait battle, remembered the night with crystalline clarity even 40 years later. "We knew we were outmatched," he told an interviewer in 1982. "The Japanese had better torpedoes, better training for night combat, but you don't think about that when you're in the middle of it. You just do your job and hope you make it through." Chen had been reassigned after the Stuart was abandoned at Surabaya. He'd served aboard the destroyer USS Pope, which was sunk just days later in the Battle of the Java Sea. He'd spent 3.5 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, enduring conditions that left him weighing 97 pounds when he was liberated in August 1945. When he learned in late 1945 that the Stuart had been recovered, that the ship he'd fought aboard was coming home, his reaction was complicated. "Part of me wanted to see her again," he said. "Part of me never wanted to see her again. She represented everything we'd lost in those early months. The Philippines, Java, all those ships, all those men." Chen never did see the Stuart again. By the time she arrived in San Francisco, he was already back home in Oregon, trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered by the war. But he followed the news reports about the ship, read about her final voyage as a target, understood why the Navy made the decision they did. "She was a ghost," he said, "not just because of what the pilot saw, but because of what she represented. You can't bring ghosts home and expect them to fit into the world again. Sometimes you have to let them go." On the Japanese side, records are harder to find. The crew of Patrol Boat 102 were never interviewed in the same systematic way that American veterans were. Many died in the final months of the war or in the chaotic aftermath. Those who survived often preferred not to speak about their service, especially service aboard a captured American vessel. But one account survives, translated from Japanese in the 1990s. A sailor identified only as Tanaka described his service aboard PB-102 in a letter to a friend. "The ship was strange to us. Everything was built differently. The doors opened the wrong way, the pipes were the wrong size, even the way the deck was laid out felt foreign. But we made it work. We had no choice. Every ship mattered." Tanaka wrote about the constant mechanical problems, the difficulty of maintaining machinery that was already old when Japan captured it, the creative solutions required to keep the engines running. He wrote about the fear during convoy run, knowing that American submarines were hunting them, knowing that at any moment a torpedo could end everything. And he wrote about the end, when American forces arrived at Hero Bay. They treated us with correctness but not cruelty. They took the ship, and we understood. It had always been their ship, really. We were just borrowing it for a while. The decision to sink the Stuart in 1946 came from multiple levels of the Navy bureaucracy, and the reasoning was documented in memos that remained classified until the 1970s. The primary justification was practical. The ship was beyond economical repair, and the Navy had no need for obsolete destroyers. But there were other considerations. A memo from the Bureau of Ships, dated April 1946, noted, "While DD 224 represents a unique historical artifact, her preservation would require resources that cannot be justified given current fleet requirement. Furthermore, her history of enemy service may complicate public perception for value." That last phrase reveals something important of the mindset. The war was just end. Emotions were still raw. The idea of preserving a ship that had served Japan, even involuntarily, was uncomfortable. Better to give her an honorable end as a target ship than to try to explain to the public why a Japanese-operated destroyer deserved preservation. Contrast that with today's perspective. When the Stuart was rediscovered in 2024, the immediate reaction from historians and the public was preservation. The wreck must be protected. Her story must be told. The complexity of her history, serving two enemies, surviving multiple attempts at destruction, makes her more valuable, not less. Dr. Delgado, speaking at a conference after the discovery, articulated this shift. In 1946, we saw the Stuart as an embarrassment, a symbol of early defeats we wanted to forget. Today we see her as a teacher. She teaches us about the complexity of war, about the human capacity for resilience, about the way history refuses to fit into neat categories of victory and defeat. The technological achievement of finding the Stuart shouldn't be understated. Ocean Infinity's multi-drone technique represents a revolution in underwater archaeology. Traditional methods would have taken weeks or months to search 37 square nautical miles at 3,500 feet depth. The autonomous vehicles did it in hours. This has profound implications for future searches. There are hundreds of ships from World War II whose locations are known only approximately. Submarines lost without trace, transport vessels torpedoed in deep water, warships sunk in battles where precise navigation wasn't possible. Each represents a story, a piece of history, potentially recoverable now with this technology. But the technology also raises questions about what we should search for, what we should find, what we should disturb. Every shipwreck is a grave site, potentially. Every discovery carries ethical implications. The Stuart is sovereign U.S. property under the Sunken Military Craft Act, which means she's protected by federal law. But that protection depends on knowing where she is, on monitoring the site, on preventing unauthorized disturbance.